host Q. We're back in this thing, you dig? And today we doing the college football playoff reaction. You know what I'm saying? The Final Four is set. And as you
Yep.
can see in the description, there have been some people that are left out. And some of us may believe that there's a legitimate argument for why they should have been left out, as well as legitimate arguments for why they should have been included. And we're here to talk about that today, and possibly towards the end of the show, depending on who shows up, we might even get into how some of these semifinal matchups might play out, which I think with the current configuration, honestly, you might get better games, but we're going to get into that later. But before we get forward, this is the first time we've been live since we hit the 1 year mark. This channel was created last year in November. November 12th, I believe, was the first live show, and we have made it a full year since then, and we're still rolling. We're 550 subscribers stronger than that first day. And it was just a random Monday, y'all. We just got together. We went on live. We were still figuring out the platform. And here we are a full year later, still doing this thing. Obviously, the videos have slowed down. Life is changing fast for all of us, but it's a blessing to be able to jump on here and drop this cool sports content and have conversations with the great followers out there. Q, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, man. I mean, it's just a blessing to be here another year, just in general. You know, you talk about, transitions in life. Lots of things have, changed in my life since we did our first podcast on this platform. And, I'm always happy to get on. I know that, T and I's schedule is kind of difficult to match up from time to time. But I will say this, when we do get together to do something like this, it's always something I look forward to, because I know that it's something that I'm going to learn something from you, and vice versa, I hope, on the other end. So it's always good to get to chat and get to talk about sports, man, because that's what we love.
Absolutely. Iron always sharpens iron, and we definitely sharpen each other up every time we get on air. So and what's funny about that is you guys really should follow us on Twitter, because that's where it really goes down. Since we don't get a lot of time, we have to have these virtual discussions, and
Right.
y'all got to get on there and start following us. My ad is below me. His ad is below him. Jump on and follow us. We have never changed our ads, so we're easy to find on Twitter. But we disagree on a lot of different things, and sometimes you don't get to see that on air because we have so little time to really get into the details. We could have a conversation over Twitter for like 3 days straight, depending on the topic. Canelo, Errol Spence, or something football related, it's a good chance that conversation might go on for several days. So you all should definitely tap in and join us for that. But this is one of those topics. I think the original tweet, I put out something about the college football playoff and what I thought was a good argument for Florida State. Now, if you go back a little bit further, I did tweet Florida State's quarterback went like 8 for 17 for 55 yards. So it looks like I'm taking a shot at them. Well, my idea is this. If you were going to say Texas, Florida State, what's a more exciting game if you got to pick one of those two? Now, at that time, I really wasn't looking at Bama, but then I had to start to accept the fact that they were definitely on the table, despite being a one-loss team, and that one loss being to a team that's probably going to make it into the playoff because they had a pretty good season. So You came back and you gave your thoughts, and you actually gave your top 4, which was spot on. I think the only thing, I think you even had the order correct, 1 through 4. So go ahead and break that down and talk to the people about kind of just what was your thought process, and then I'll kind of give some feedback from there.
Yeah, I think for me, man, what it honestly came down to was not necessarily who I thought was most deserving, but ultimately for me, it came down to who I thought was most likely going to get in. And historically, when you look at the college football playoff, the last 9 years that they've been doing this since they transitioned from the BCS format, every single year there's been at least one SEC team. And in a lot of situations, there's been 2 SEC teams. So looking at that and knowing how much the voters have valued the rating, or however the quality they value in the SEC, I knew that whoever won the SEC championship between Alabama and Georgia was more than likely going to get in. And the reason that I kind of felt that way was just off of the history that comes into play, as well as the simple fact that ultimately, what is the college football playoff about? It's about making money. And they're going to want teams, ideally, that are going to bring the most eyeballs, that on paper would be the most competitive matchups, that are going to get people to sit down for 6 to 7 hours and watch not just one semifinal, but both semifinals. I'll give you a perfect example. They strayed away from this one of the first years that they did the college football playoff rankings in 2016 when they put the University of Washington in. If I remember correctly, that was a year where they had a one loss, I believe. They had one loss, but they were not as good as the UW team that's in this year, at least on paper. And their quarterback was not as highly touted as the quarterback Michael Penix that's going to be in this year's college football playoff. And they played Alabama, and I believe it was actually here at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, and they got whitewashed. I mean, it was like 42-3, and the game was over halfway through the second quarter. Well, that's something that I thought that the voters were going to be trying to avoid as much as possible. So I kind of had a feeling that once you get to a third quarterback for Florida State and your quarterback only scores 16 points while he's a freshman, it's his first time starting, I was pretty confident that they were not going to put them in if there was a chance to give that spot to someone else who they felt would make a more competitive matchup. So that's kind of why my rationale about why I thought who would get in.
Right. And, you know, my common sense obviously told me that that was a very strong possibility. And it's, to me, the only argument you have is they're on their third string quarterback. To me, just having somebody, because if you start to look at just economic impact, okay, there could be there's ebb and flow with that. You know, at one point in time, you could get a Miami Hurricanes memorabilia or paraphernalia anywhere. You know what I'm saying? But now they're hard pressed. There was a time where you could get, there's just certain stuff, there's ebb and flow with that. So if we're talking popularity, which fans will travel and which team has support, the teams that were in like the top 6 to 10, if they all were like one-loss teams, all of them travel good, to be honest, if you look at like the top 10. So that ain't even a question. So the big issue for me was, if this team is banged up, okay, they've made it this far and they look different on paper now than they did. And then they actually look different on the field too. So I will give that. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't get it together enough to be competitive in the postseason. And I think that it's unfair. You know, you're always told, beat who are in front of you, win the games on your schedule, and everything will be fine. Win and you're in is what you're told. But then you win and you win and win, and to the tune of 13 victories, and then you still don't get in. You know, it starts to put all this pressure on. It's about your conference. It's about your affiliation. And I mean, to some degree it is, because Texas ain't just going to the SEC just because, you know what I'm saying? There's some leverage in being there. And I just feel bad for Florida State. And my idea was, you go 3 undefeateds and then the next best conference champion. You have 4 teams. You would have 4 teams that all won their division, all won their conference. And then you would have the 5th team. The only reason you leave them out is because they lost to one of the teams in the top 4. And I thought that that's a legitimate, well-deserved pecking order. And that's why I felt like there was a possibility they would just go with an undefeated Power 5 conference champion with the conference championship win should be in. And you just didn't get that.
So my question to you in that case would be, because, you know, this conversation for you and I started on social media a few hours ago. If that's the case, do you believe that the right call in this situation was to have no SEC teams at all in this year's playoff, based on the fact that, you know, your valuing or your evaluation of what should be the ratings is that Florida State, while losing 2 quarterbacks and on a third string quarterback, still undefeated in an ACC that by most people's perception was not as strong of a conference as other conferences this year,
which is crazy.
Do you think that they should have been in over both SEC teams?
Absolutely. Here's why. And I mentioned this. They actually have, and remember, the context is this season. This isn't a historical pick. This is for the 2023-24 season. The way things have played out to this point, the ACC has a better non-conference record against the other teams than the SEC. And head to head,
other teams being who we talking about, like SEC versus ACC, or just against any other Power 5 school?
So I'm gonna give you both. Okay. So against the Power 5, they went 10-9 this year. The SEC went 6-7. No. They went 7-9 against. So that's against all the other Power 5s. Against each other, the ACC went 6-4 against the SEC. So what that tells me is, Okay, maybe 5 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, the SEC was a stronger team, was a stronger conference. But this year, that's not the case. So if we're going off strength of conference as a parameter, whatever, the ACC has shown that they're there. Some of the other numbers, the team with the best, I mean, not team, but the conference with the best. Let me add this to the screen so you can, so folks can see what we got here. All right, there we go. All right, so we got a graphic up there. This is the final standings. The way that the committee decided was what they want to see going forward. But the Pac-12, I believe, went 7-3 in non-conference games. The Big 12 went like 6-6. What's the other one? Who am I missing?
Big 10.
Big 10 had a losing record. Big 10. So you had two teams with a winning non-conference record. You had two teams with a losing non-conference record. I mean, not teams, but conferences. And then the Big 12 had a 6-6 record in non-conference games. So if we're looking at strength of conference, head to head, the ACC actually did better against the SEC and did better overall than the SEC. So that was part of my argument too. This was information that I had when I was making my statements earlier, that if you're going to use historical context, well, back in 2009, Texas was undefeated, so maybe they should be number one this year. You know what I'm saying? That's how that sounds to me when you say, well, traditionally having the SEC in it means something. It doesn't mean something to me. Number one, because my team isn't in that conference. And number two, they didn't do as good as people think. You just hear SEC and people think, oh, well, they probably got a winning record against all the other conferences, when it turned out they actually don't. So how do you justify it outside of just saying we think that Alabama's going to bring more money? That's literally all you're saying to me. So that means you're going to value money. If you have 6 undefeated teams, the most popular teams that you think are going to bring the most money are going to get in every time if you were to keep the 14 format. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's more than just money. I think that money plays a role, and obviously it plays a role in everything, right? It plays a role not only in football, it plays a role in boxing, it plays a role in every sport that we talk about on this platform. So yes, money absolutely does play a factor. But I don't think that it was solely decided on just because it's the SEC and they think that it's a money team, because obviously Florida State has a rich tradition of being a great football factory program of their own. They have a history of doing that all the way back, into the mid 80s, when you talk about their great rivalry that began with the University of Miami. But I think the thing that they're kind of thinking about is, if you take those two teams, and you can see it lined up right there on your left, Michigan, we knew was going to be in. We knew that from the jump because they won every game on their slate. They won their conference championship. They were in the top 4 the entire year, pretty much. They didn't waver out of the top 4, as well as the fact that they're a completely healthy team at all of their most important positions, right? When you talk about quarterback, when you talk about running back, when you talk about their starting wide receivers, they're a completely healthy team that hasn't been affected by injuries at this point. So I kind of already knew that was a shoo-in. They were going to be in, and they blasted, I forget who it was they played. Iowa. Iowa. In the Big Ten championship game, 26-0, and they really could have been worse than that if they would have kept their foot on the gas. But then you're talking about putting them in, talking about Florida State, or putting Alabama in, and who gives Michigan a better game? I think that that's what they did, and they looked at it because they knew that Texas was going to get in. They knew that Washington would get in based on the results of what they already had ranked. I think that they ultimately were making the decision between, do we want to put Florida State in this position to play Michigan? Do we think that they give them as good of a game, or could they possibly beat them like Alabama could? Because Alabama just beat the number 1 team that we would have had in as the best team in college football. That's what they would have been. If Georgia would have won that game, Georgia would have been number 1 and nobody would have questioned it, and they just beat that team. So I think that that's ultimately the two factors that played the biggest role, is that they think that the biggest factor that will come into play when you have a competitive matchup is who's more likely to win that game. And I think that it was just a hard split of hairs. Unfortunately, one of the more ironic things that I didn't even realize until I was kind of reading some responses to the stories that were breaking was the simple fact that the ACC, including Florida State's athletic director, voted to not expand the playoffs a year early. So ironically, he ended up screwing his own team because they ended up as a conference, the ACC as well as the school individually voted to not expand the playoffs to 8 teams this season. They voted to keep it at 4 teams, and that's exactly what ended up cutting them out of it ultimately, whether it was warranted or not.
Or maybe he just knew his team was going to go undefeated and he was confident they would be in the top 4, so he wasn't worried about it. Maybe that's what it was. That's all I'm saying. But
in an idealistic world, then maybe that's what he thought.
But he wasn't wrong. His team went undefeated and they was in the top 4 on the last day of the year, but they got passed over. So, and that's how the cookie crumbles sometimes, unfortunately. And that's why we watch sports. You know what I mean? There's always some dynamic that you just can't account for. But seriously, to respond to what you're saying, that was what I was kind of alluding to earlier about the matchups. When I sat down and I looked at the matchups, and I said this on Angry Man Sports, AM Sports Media's their pre-reaction video. They did a reaction beforehand, and I told them, I said, this is my top 4, but I would need to change the order a little bit because I don't like to put one-loss teams over undefeated teams. But I said there's a reason I would do it. I said on paper I would go Michigan, Washington, Florida State, Texas. But then you put your best matchup in the first round. You put Texas against Michigan. I don't think that UW versus Florida State would have been a good game. And I think that the winner of the Michigan-Texas game will probably put some real pressure on UW. That's my opinion. I think UW's a great team, but I just think that Michigan and Texas have a different gear that they just don't have yet. And they haven't really faced a team that will push them in a way that Texas and Michigan would, especially defensively. Now, I don't want to go too far because I want to give you a chance to respond to some of that. But I said, but if I flip my rankings and I put Texas at 3 and I keep Florida State in there, I think in the first round you get 2 meh games, but then you get a hell of a final. And if Washington and Florida State are to survive that first round, I think that they match up really well and put on a really entertaining, competitive championship game as well. Or if it's Michigan, Texas, I think that's a good game. So I thought that that configuration with Texas landing at 3, not just because I'm a fan, but from a matchup standpoint, I thought that would make sense. So I want to get your thoughts on it. You kind of started touching on it, so I'd like you to go a little bit deeper and talk about when you were thinking about who's going to make it in. Let's say it wasn't Alabama for some reason. As far as 3 and 4, if it had to be Florida State, how would you do your top 4?
So if you're saying if Alabama is not the team that gets in, if Florida State would have been in, how would I have ranked them? I think if I was going to put them in order, if I'm not putting Alabama, I would have just slid Florida State in as number 4. I would have moved Texas to I would have slid Florida State in at number 4, left Texas where they are at number 3. That's what I would have done. And the reason that I would have done that is because while Texas has a loss, I think that Texas faced more top-level, elite-level teams at various points throughout the season. I think that really, when you look at it, Florida State played 2 teams that you could say, okay, they could be a top 10 team legitimately at the end of the season, or they could be the top 10 team at this point in the season. When you talk about Louisville, right, who really, really struggled, I was very surprised at how much they struggled on offense, especially when you're going up against a quarterback from Florida State who only produces 16 points. For them to only score 6 was kind of honestly, it was a little bit of an embarrassment.
FSU defense.
And credit to them, right? Credit to them because ultimately defense plays a role in this too. But everybody knows that football now is led and spearheaded by offense. And that's why I don't think that they wanted to put Florida State in this bracket, because ultimately I don't think that the College Football Playoff Voting Committee was confident that they would be able to keep up from an offensive production standpoint. Michigan has a solid defense. Texas has a solid defense. Alabama has a solid defense. Washington is really the only team here that I would say is a tier below when you talk about defense. But ultimately, they have probably the best offense. You can argue and debate it, but I would say that they have one of the best offenses, top 2 in this group of 4, in my opinion. So when you look at it like that, I think it's difficult to try to say that they're going to be able to keep up with a brand new freshman who really, really struggled in his first start. He's going to go a month without playing again because these games are not going to be played till New Year's Day. So we're talking basically a month from now. And that's going to be his next start. He doesn't get anything other than practice time between now and then. And I just don't see him making that leap between now and then. Now, maybe the defense helps him out by, keeping the other team down offensively slightly. But I don't think that that's the kind of game that these teams want. I mean, the college football playoff committee, they want a 35-28 game. They want a 28-24 game that goes into over. That's what they want. They don't want what we used to get in the BCS when it was Nebraska, against Miami, where it's a 13-9 game. That's not going to do the numbers that they want to do. Yeah. When they have an option to choose something else, I think that that's what they're going to choose. And that's the whole idea behind having a committee, is that they get to vote the teams in that they think are the most deserving. And unfortunately, they didn't think that Florida State was deserving enough because they only have 2 top wins. All the other teams had at least 3.
And see, to me, that's part of the flaw in it. Before I go, shout out to Carmen Serene for tapping in. She said, dropping in for support. I don't know anything about footy ball. That's okay. We appreciate you tapping in and getting that watch time for us. Hey, and she a fellow, she down here in Texas like us. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So shout out to her for showing support. We appreciate that. But to respond to what you're saying, I get that if we get an opportunity to choose the matchups, we're going to pick what we think are the most exciting matchups. But I think that some criteria up front should make that clear that, well, I mean, besides history, like now historically, they're going to be able to say, we've always picked more exciting teams. We don't always pick what's the best teams or the best records. We pick what we think is going to be the most exciting matchups. And that's why we moved Texas, into 3, because they could have easily put Alabama at 4 if they thought that. You know what I'm saying? They could have easily put Alabama at 3 or flipped it, because these are going to be what I believe to be competitive games. And I think they have an idea what's going to be produced. Either you get Washington in an explosive game against Michigan, or you get Washington and probably what's going to be a tough game against Alabama. On the flip side, maybe you get Texas, who will be battle tested at that point against Michigan, which should be a dogfight, or you get a revenge game. Alabama, we're better now. Our quarterback is playing better. He had a rough game against Texas at home. Now he gets to go on the road and redeem himself. So you got these storylines. I get that, but I still don't think that should supersede a team winning all their games and being a Power 5 team. I can't get past that, because I think that it means that the wins don't matter as much as they tell you they do. Win and get in has been the thing forever, our entire lives. As long as I've been a sports fan, you keep winning, you bound to get to the championship. This team kept winning, and because someone got hurt, and it breaks my heart to see what the young kid said. I can't remember the quarterback's name. Forgive me for that, guys. No disrespect, but he was like, I wish I had gotten hurt earlier. So look at how unselfish this player is. He's not even saying, I wish I didn't get hurt. He's accepting that. He's saying, I just wish it had happened earlier so they couldn't penalize this team. And I mean, honestly, I don't know that they would end up undefeated if he hadn't gotten hurt, sooner. But the fact of the matter is they carried on, and then they won after his injury. And it's kind of like, it sucks for Florida State to me. And I think that once expansion happens, we're still going to have question marks. But I think if you got a top 8, top 12 type of situation, it's hard to argue, because at some point they're going to have to play football, and somebody going to get their ass kicked and is going to tell everybody in the world, you wanted to be in here and it looks like you didn't belong. You know what I'm saying? In this situation, we don't know if Georgia just had an off day. Georgia been doing their thing all year. Now, the truth is, I already knew Georgia been having a struggle season. They hadn't been playing great. But I also believe that Alabama hasn't been playing great. They went life and death with a bunch of teams that they should have been able to beat. And now you say that despite those things, they're more deserving than Florida State. What do you think about that as far as their struggles this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's certainly clear that the SEC as a whole, while it's still a very good conference, it's not the best it's ever been. That's clear and without doubt. And the reason I know that is because, like I mentioned when we first started this conversation, there's been occasions where 2 of these teams have gotten in. both teams from the conference championship game. And I believe even in two occasions, it was Georgia and Alabama, because 2 years ago, I think Georgia played Alabama in the national championship game, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it might
So
have been 3 years.
I think it was either 2 or 3 years ago,
Yeah,
whichever. But that goes to show you that they have had years where they've been better than they are currently. However, I still feel like when you were to match up the Power Five conferences and you look at the totality of the seasons, I think that the SEC is not the fifth best conference. I think the ACC was the fifth best conference. And the only reason that I can say that is because at the end of the day, when you look at the end of the season rankings, and I'll pull them up real quick just because we're trying to look at them as we go along. I think that ultimately you have to try to lean towards who you think the top caliber teams are based on what they did when they ranked all these teams at the very end of the season. And I'm looking here, Alabama, Georgia, Missouri, Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee. So they had, what was that, 5 teams in the top 25 that ended the season that way. So when you look at it like that from that perspective, I don't know how they were not going to perceive that they could make their rankings that way, but then not have any of their teams in if 2 of their teams were in the top 5 to begin that week, the last week of the season. I just knew that one of them was going to get in. I mean, I had no surprise there.
I mean, part of that too was the fact that they didn't play each other. You know, when you look at a lot of the other conferences, they get parity because they all play each other. When you have that East-West format, you can get some teams that basically dodge each other and they won't see each other till the conference championship. And that's why the conference championship for the SEC is so important, because these teams can go all year and not see each other, you know, in a rotating year. So what that means to me is, despite where the final rankings landed, as far as, you know, 5 SEC teams being ranked with 2 in the top 4, you already knew there was a collision course for, or no, where was Alabama? Alabama was like top 10 at the, like number 8 or something. They were number 8.
They started the week at number 8. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were 8. And another piece of history has been made. Just a side note, a team had never jumped from 8 to 4 until this year. So, and like everybody said, this was the year to do it because it's Alabama at number 8. So this is the year that history will be made. And that being said, though, what my point was is all those teams being ranked that way in the head-to-head matchups, how could a ranking outweigh head-to-head? The ACC.
Who are we comparing?
The ACC against the SEC. Yeah, the ACC against the SEC. How could rankings outweigh head-to-head matchups on the grass where the games are actually played? One conference was better than the other, and it's indisputable evidence of that. It's not an opinion. A ranking is an opinion at the end of the day. I think that this team is better than this one. That's just my opinion. That's a ranking unless they play head-to-head. So if you go head-to-head, you know what's the number one tiebreaker in most sports? What's your record head-to-head? Exactly. So how can you disregard that when the fact of the matter is this conference performed better than the other, and then they produce an undefeated champion after a conference championship game? That's going to be something. That's a hill I'm willing to stand on and fight on. You know, I ain't got to die on it because it ain't my team. But what if it were my team? I would want it to be fair. Like, what if an undefeated Big 12 team shows up? What happens then? Remember, this was kind of a thing with Baylor a few years ago, but then Baylor ended up losing. So they made it easy for them. We almost had this a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate argument. And unfortunately, that's what happens when you have these situations where only 4 teams get in. I never really liked the idea that only 4 teams would get in and get a true shot at the championship, because there have been multiple years where there have been more than 4 teams that had a legitimate shot of winning the bracket, getting all the way to the championship game, and winning it all. You know, college football has much more parity now than it ever has in the past. In the past, you know, you'd have repeat champions, you'd have rematch title games on a regular basis. But things have really spread out, and especially now with NIL, where teams can ultimately stay on the same recruiting path if they have the funds to do so. It's kind of leveled the playing field for a lot of these schools to retain their own players, to keep their own players within their own region, and spread out the talent to where ultimately we have more parity within college football. Everybody's not going to just Alabama. Everybody's not going to just LSU or just going to Georgia. A lot of these teams, on the West Coast or the East Coast or in the Midwest, are able to retain their talent. So ultimately, this was unfortunate because it was one of the years where there was a legitimate reason to have 5 teams in, but they took a vote, before the season, before anything ever happened. A vote was taken to try to move that expansion, that playoff expansion, up a year earlier and say, hey, let's do it this year because maybe we're anticipating that this will be a year where there's more parity than there ever has been. It just so happens that it turned out to be exactly that way. The beautiful thing about this, though, is that while we're going to an expansion next season, there's only really going to be 4 quote unquote Power 5 conferences next year because the Pac-12 is going to be dissolving effectively. So you're going to have, your number 1 team from the Big 12, the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12, and whoever makes it to that championship game to win it is almost going to be in every situation guaranteed their spot in because it's only going to be 4 major Power 5 conferences. What will be Power 4 now? And then the last 4 will be probably divvied out between the next best teams of either the runner-ups in those conferences or maybe an undefeated team that's from a group of 5 conference that maybe isn't in as strong of a schedule. The one thing I would ask you, though, and I did want to mention this to you before we move on, do you think that Florida State ultimately was hurt by the fact that they didn't add a second high-ranked team to their non-conference schedule? Do you think that that would have affected anything at all if they would have played another top 10 team? Because I'm looking, the only other teams that they played outside of conference play was LSU, which is an awesome win. That's a week 1 win by double digits. They blew out LSU at a point when a lot of people thought LSU might be a national title contender. Still a very, very good team, just not on that level. Yeah. And then their next game is Southern Miss, and then they threw North Alabama in there, which ultimately happened to be the game that doomed their season because that's the game that Jordan Travis got hurt. Their starting quarterback. So do you think that the committee would have given them a little bit more love if they had one more top 25 ranked team on their schedule that they played?
No, because they did everything they were supposed to do. And when the season ended, they were in the top 4. And then they won their conference championship game. So the voters, the ranking system put them consistently where they needed to be in position to be included. So I don't think that hurt them in any way. I could see that perspective though, and we could discuss that a little bit because scheduling is also important. Your non-conference schedule, Texas putting Alabama on the schedule, seems like it paid off big for them all of a sudden.
That's that what put them in, to be honest with you.
Yeah, because if it's a 1-loss Texas and you don't have that road win against Alabama, the Big 12 ain't in it.
Yep.
You probably gonna get Georgia and Alabama in it at this point. Am I right?
I would say this. I don't know that Georgia and Alabama get in that situation. I think what happens is
who do you put in instead?
Let's say Alabama gets in. Let's say Alabama beats Texas in that game. Let's just say they won that game.
Okay. Well,
but Texas goes on to win the championship or win the Big 12 championship. Excuse me. They're a 10-2 team instead of an 11-1 team.
Lost team. Yeah, we're completely out anyway.
They're out, right? Georgia, let's say, loses to Alabama, right? So then Alabama would have a win over Georgia and a win over Texas, who would have still been in the top 10 at that point. I think they get in, and then I think Florida State brings up the caboose. That's what I think happens in that situation. Ultimately, while Texas solidified themselves way back at the beginning of the season, they still had to lock it in by winning the Big 12 championship game. I'm personally convinced that that game alone is what made their season, because there's no argument you can make to put Alabama in without putting Texas. You can't do it. You can't do it because they won the head-to-head matchup. They won their conference. They have one loss just like Alabama does, and their loss came in a neutral site as opposed to a loss at home. So that honestly, for me, saved their season, because if you flip it and a team like Oklahoma does what they're supposed to do, and then let's say that they were in Texas's place, I don't think they get in because they didn't play Alabama.
Yeah. No,
Oh,
I agree with that, and that's what I'm saying. And in my scenario, I'm saying, let's say we switch out Alabama for, I don't know, what's a mediocre team that's not ranked. That, let's say we put somebody else in that spot, just anybody, any random opponent. We're gonna call them random
Pittsburgh.
opponent. Okay,
Pittsburgh.
Pitt. So we beat Pitt unranked, not a good team, but we beat Pitt, and then we still get here with that one loss to Oklahoma. Florida State's gonna get in there over us,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
despite the
Because they'd
fact
be in
that
the
we're
same
probably a
situation.
better team wire to wire.
Yeah, because they'd be in the same situation with a loss. Because then the argument is well, you'd only have two top elite level wins when you talk about Texas. They'd have, two elite level wins. They beat Oklahoma State, and who was the other team that they beat earlier this season? I can't remember who else was on their schedule. But they had one other, I think, like top 15 win.
Well, but Texas is like 4-1 against the top 25. The only losses against Oklahoma. So
they beat Oklahoma State in the championship game, and they lost to Oklahoma, and they beat 23 Kansas State, and then obviously if we're saying if they would have lost the Alabama game, if they don't win that game, they're in the same situation that Florida State is now by not having enough elite level wins on their schedule, along with also having a loss. So I can't see them having got in over.
Yeah, and that's where kind of I was bringing that around just to kind of make it to your point. I think that for whatever reason, the Big 12, the non-conference schedule is a bit more important when they start to consider the Big 12. It's been that way for a minute because when Baylor and I think it was Oklahoma gets a pass on it for whatever reason because they've had a weak non-conference schedule before and still was in like that top 4 when they were trying to figure out who's going. But Texas doesn't get that. Baylor didn't get that. And my biggest issue is I don't know that it really affected Florida State as much because they went undefeated. And that's the thing. If you got one loss, then it means a lot more what your non-conference schedule looks like. Because if you think about it, if we're undefeated, it doesn't matter. Like if we beat Oklahoma, let's say we go undefeated, we run it up 13-0. And when I say we, I mean Texas guys. Y'all know I'm a Hornets fan. Let's say we run it up and go 13-0. Our non-conference schedule won't matter. I don't think we're the same. We're not viewed the same in this particular scenario as FSU would have been. That's just my opinion. But if you still got it on your screen, go ahead and pop it back up so I can put it on the screen. Let's look at the rankings again and let's talk about these 2 first round matchups. And we can map some of this out. And I think maybe we should try to come back another time after they play and maybe talk about the championship game because I'd like to give it its just due. And I'd like to know who it's going to be. I don't want to try to guess. And then we'll know who's healthy because right now Texas is possibly going to be without Xavier Worthy, which is a very explosive player. And I think a key member of the offense. We're already down Jonathan Brooks, who's a All-American, in my opinion, All-American running back who was cut down, before the season ended. So I kind of want to know what the teams are going to look like on paper before we get into whatever the championship might be. But we could talk about these matchups coming up.
Yeah, no doubt. I'll pull it up here in just a second.
So while Q gets that ready, guys, anybody that's watching, go ahead and drop in the comments. Who is your college football team and how did they do this year? And what do you think about their future in terms of how that is the NIL helping your school? Is the NIL working against your school? Let me know what you think. And we will get some more videos out, obviously, in the future. I got some thoughts on how Coach Prime's season played out up there in Colorado. That bandwagon got real light around week 6.
Man, look, that's what happens when you lose 5 of 6. That's what happens.
Yeah. And my thoughts on that, they run deep, so I got a whole video on queuing up for that. But I want to get you guys' thoughts. First of all, just tell us who you're rooting for in college football, and do you agree with the playoff selection committee and who they put and the order that they put them in? Because obviously, you got 3 and 4, and if people think the SEC is a better conference, why would you rank them below the Big 12?
Yeah.
So you guys, kind of drop that there. And you got the rankings up, right? That we were looking at earlier.
I'm going on right now.
Okay.
All right, there you go.
All right, cool. Let me get this back on the screen. All right. So here we have it. Round 1. I believe they call it the semifinal. We will have Michigan and Alabama. That's 1 versus 4. And then we will have Washington versus Texas. That's 2 versus 3. So you've got 2 undefeateds facing off against 12-1 conference champions. Let's start with Alabama, Michigan. What are your thoughts on how you see this game going based on what we know today? What do you think about this matchup as far as head-to-head?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most difficult matchup that Michigan could have gotten to start with, because of the fact that Jalen Milroe is a mobile, super athletic quarterback. I think ultimately that's the thing that's going to be the kryptonite for Michigan is mobile quarterbacks. We saw, C.J. Stroud had a lot of success against the Michigan defense last year. Milroe is not the passer that C.J. Stroud is, but he is a much better athlete. And I think that Alabama is hitting their stride at the right time, so to speak. It's kind of like college basketball. You don't want to peak too early. You don't want to hit your stride in December. You want to hit it right before you get to March Madness. And I think that Alabama is doing that now, where he's really playing some of his best ball at this point in the season. I don't know how well Michigan's receivers are going to do against the DBs from Alabama, because it seems like they had a really, really strong game against Georgia, while Georgia did have a lot of receivers that were hampered or injured. I do acknowledge that, their number one tight end, their number one receiver were both dealing with foot or ankle injuries. But, the proof is in the pudding that when you give Nick Saban 4 weeks to prepare for one team, his teams typically play the best in this round. They don't necessarily play the best in the championship game, but in that semifinal game, they play the best because he's had a long time, him and his staff have had a long time to prepare themselves for that team. So I think that this is going to be a really difficult draw for Michigan. And if you watch, I didn't get to share the link with you, but there was a video clip of when Michigan got notified on the screen with the reveal show that they were going to be playing Alabama. You could almost hear like the disappointment in the room. Was like, oh, yeah, okay, so they know what's coming. And can Michigan win this game? Absolutely, they can win this game. But would they have rather seen Alabama potentially for a national championship? Yes, of course. I think they would have preferred to have to play a team like that to win it all, as opposed to just to get to the championship game to try to win it all. So my perspective is that Alabama will certainly make it a difficult game, but ultimately I think that Michigan makes enough plays that they do win this game. But I think that it's a little bit lower scoring than people might assume. I think it ends up being somewhere around, 24-28, 24-21, somewhere in that range. I think that will happen because I think Michigan will try to commit to the run to try to keep Alabama's offense off the field.
Yeah, I believe that this is probably going to be the more grueling of the two games. This is going to be more ground and pound, punch in the mouth, get up, punch you back in the mouth type of thing. And I believe that because Michigan has shown that they have that. This is a gritty team that has shown that they can win the slugfest and not a shootout necessarily, which I think that they're capable of that too. But they've shown that they can win the slugfest. And I think that's what you're going to get with this version of Alabama. Now, what I believe is that the Alabama QB, what I saw from him against Texas and then later in the season, it still shows up. If you could force him to make certain types of throws, he's not an elite passer. And if you could force him to throw deep, like take away the intermediate stuff, which I think Michigan is capable of, take away the intermediate stuff and him in when he wants to run, you're going to force him to throw it deep. And that's where he makes the most mistakes because he doesn't have the precision and the touch on his passes. And I think that that's going to be Michigan's key to victory, because if you could slow down Alabama scoring in any way, you're going to give yourself a better chance, because I don't think that Alabama's defense is going to slow down Michigan's offense all day. There's going to be pockets where they get a chance to get points, and they're going to figure some things out, and they're going to become explosive. And if you can't go score for score, that's going to be a wrap. I don't see it playing out like Georgia, where Alabama was able to hold Georgia. I think at one point it was like 7-3, like they was in striking distance, and then they kind of took control. I don't see that happening with Michigan. They got to be foot on the gas the whole way. So I personally think that I kind of see Michigan winning it by double digits, just because I think that there'll be a little bit too much for Alabama. I think Alabama's going to put up a great fight, but down the stretch, I think the war of attrition is going to favor Michigan in this one, and I think that they're going to win this game by double digits.
Okay. Do you think that this game ultimately boils down to the quarterbacks? Do you think that it boils down to which team has a better performance from their quarterback? Is the team that won the game?
Yes, I do, because I believe that it's going to be how the defense, again, the one thing I gave you as a strategy for Michigan was how can they make the quarterback have a hard day? And if they can if they could force him to do the thing he does the least best, they're going to have a good day. And I think that Alabama's defense is going to bend first. And that's going to be a problem for them winning the game. That's kind of why, it's going to be ultimately, when you look at the final stat lines, unless there's some stat padding at some point late in the game when it's already out of reach, I think the tail of the tape is going to say that one quarterback figured the other defense out and he took his team to victory.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's go ahead and look at the other game, and it's going to be number 2 Washington, undefeated, facing the Texas Longhorns, Big 12 conference champions. Only loss was to Oklahoma, and it was a close loss in the game where they didn't play their best, and they still were up with like 2 minutes left with a chance to win the game. So now this team finishes the season fairly strong. They've had some struggles, some very close games. On the flip side, I don't feel like Washington really played anybody too close. I don't feel like they've been in any dogfights.
I'm about to look. They had two really difficult wins against Oregon. Both of these games against Oregon, they won both games by 3. They had a really difficult game against Oregon State. They won that game by 2 at Oregon State. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, realistically, those were the 3 most difficult games. They beat Utah by 7, but they pretty much cruised that entire game, and they did everything they wanted against USC offensively. So, the 3 toughest games were the 2 Oregon games. Listen, man, that's a whole other video, brother. That's a whole other video to talk about.
That would hurt, I'm sure. But no, and I feel like from a battle tested standpoint, I've talked about this in many regards when it comes to football specifically. Teams that can win grueling games, it pays off for them if they can make it to the championship round of things. And not just being a Texas fan. Obviously, I've watched every game this year. I didn't watch every UW game, but I went back and watched quite a few because I wanted to see what the buzz was about. And I don't feel like they struggled to the level where Texas had to rally a couple times. Like that Houston game was a nail biter. You know what I mean? Like, the TCU game, if I'm not mistaken, was a nail biter, and they had to like muster up the strength to come back and win those games. And I think that tells you something about your squad. And then not to mention you had to overcome the injury to Quinn Ewers, and Malik Murphy had to come in and he got hurt in substitute duty. And we had to see Arch Manning and stuff like that. All of that to say, head to head, I think from a speed standpoint, it's equal. I think from a skill standpoint, it's equal. What it's going to come down to, I think this game is going to be really about coaching and which coach can fool the opposing defense. And I lean Sark because I've seen him do it consistently everywhere he's gone. He's been a very innovative coach, and watching him over the season, I'll be the first to admit I was not a big fan of him being hired. I didn't like it. But now that I've seen it play out in the way that we've become productive on offense and the way that we've been able to get points. And I mean, at one point in the season, we was like averaging like 35 points a game against pretty decent competition. And I'm like, wow, this dude know what the hell he doing for real. And now I'm seeing it week after week. So I might be a little biased, I'll say that, but I think that he might figure out the opposing defense first. He figured out Oklahoma, he figured out Alabama, and he was able to be real productive against both those teams. So I lean Texas, not just because I think, not just because I'm a Texas fan, but because I just think that offensively they're going to figure it out first, and their defense is going to bow up at the right time like they've done time and time again this season and pull off a close win.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate, result that could come up. The one thing I will say, and I've looked at it, and if you can just look at a trend when you look at their schedule and you look at their final scores, and I'll read them off to you. Talking about Washington. Washington scored 56 points in week 1, 43 in week 2, 41 in week 3, 59 in week 4, 31, 36. They had a week where they were pretty much really bad. They against Arizona State, they only scored 15 points. That was like week 9. They had 42 against Stanford, 52 against SC, 35 against Utah. And then really it hasn't been until the last 3 weeks where they haven't looked like the team that they were the first basically 9 to 10 weeks of the season. They scored 24 points against Washington State, 22 against Oregon State, and then they had a decent showing this past game with 34 points against Oregon in their rematch.
So before you go, can I ask this? Because you mentioned it to me, so I'm going to flip the question back to you, or something you mentioned earlier about peaking too early.
Yeah.
If you could, as you give your feedback on this particular one, consider that as well. Did they peak too early? But go ahead.
You know, I think that it's legit. I think there's a legitimate question as to if they peak too early, and I think ultimately that's why the bookies going into the Pac-12 championship favored Oregon by 9.5 points. For those that didn't get a chance to look at the line before that game started, Oregon, a team that they beat earlier this season at home in what was effectively the Pac-12's regular season game of the year, they beat Oregon by 3 at home. They had to turn around and play Oregon again because of what you mentioned earlier. They dissolved the divisional standings in the Pac-12, I think 2 years ago. So two former North teams in the Pac-12 played each other in the championship game. When you talk about Washington and Oregon, that's why I think that they had them ranked as being, not the favorite. They were the underdog in that game because a lot of teams thought that, well, Washington may have hit their peak a little too early because of the last 2 weeks of the season. They scored less than 30 points when they scored more than 30 points in like 8 of their other 9 games that season. So, yeah, I think that there's a legitimate possibility that they did peak a little early. They did have an injury to their major, a major part of their offense when you talk about their number 2 receiver in McMillan. He got hurt, and he's just kind of coming back from an injury. He played for the first time in, I think, 3 weeks in the championship game, and he wasn't necessarily himself, but he was out there and he was making some plays for Washington against Oregon this past weekend. So I think that it's going to pay big dividends that he gets a whole month to try to recoup and kind of rehab that ankle injury that he did have before they play against Texas. But ultimately, I think it comes down to this. I don't think it necessarily comes down to the quarterback because I think they're drawing a blank there when you talk about Ewers versus Penix, in my opinion. I think where it comes down to is which team can run the ball more effectively against the other team's defensive line. Washington's defensive line is solid. I wouldn't say that they're as good as Texas's defensive line. But Washington has shown in the last 3 weeks that they can run the ball and they're willing to run the ball, even though their offense has primarily been highlighted and predicated on their passing game. So I think their running back is a transfer from the SEC. I think he went to Auburn or Alabama. I can't remember where he went previously, but he's an SEC transfer. So he's a guy that's capable. So ultimately, I think that that's what it comes down to. But I'm going to agree with you. I think that Texas should win this game. I think that they win this game somewhere around and I think it's going to be high scoring just based on the fact that both quarterbacks are capable. I think it's a 42-35, 42-31 kind of a game. I think that it gets that high because, I think that it gets that high. And the only reason that I say that is because I'm looking at how Texas played this past weekend and how much they leaned heavily on their passing game. They didn't really run it a whole lot from what I noticed during the game, throughout the game, because they really didn't have to. And I think Washington is going to come into this game knowing, okay, our strength is not running the ball, even though we've been able to do it really well. And I think that they would rather go against the defensive backfield of Texas rather than the front seven of Texas. So I think that that's why they're going to lean more towards a passing game, which leads to, I think, more points. And I think ultimately Texas wins a thriller. I think that that's what happens.
That's pretty interesting. And I tend to agree with you. One thing I will say is in the Big 12 championship game, something like you said, Texas didn't really need to run the ball. And when they needed to salt the game away late, because they could have probably put up 70. I mean, Ewers had 250 and 4 touchdowns at halftime. They took the air out of the ball and just start running it. And you're talking about the 2 and 3 running back. You talk about Baxter and Blue running the ball. And then at some point, our fourth string running back comes in the game and he's productive. So I forget his name. He's number 17. It's like Porter or something like that. But anyway, this team runs deep in the running game, and I think that that's going to pay dividends for Texas, and that's why I put it as a closer game and a lower scoring game, because I think that Texas will try to limit the amount of possessions Washington has to make sure they're not able to be in the rhythm or become explosive. But on the flip side, Sark is Sark, and he might say, well, I'm going to out chess you, and he's going to pull his old Sean Payton act, and he going to want to air that thing out. And he got a quarterback that could go 35 for 38 for 450 yards and 6 touchdowns, because he knows he has that guy. He might go YOLO and do that. So what you're saying is a very legitimate possibility. So this could be a couple exciting games.
If you think about it realistically, I mean, not in a bad way, but Sark is a guy he's an offensive coach, right? He's a guy that wants to show that he has the bigger gun than you. He does. Ultimately, that's what he wants to do. Does he want to win? Absolutely. Does he want to make it to the championship game? Absolutely. But if he can throw for 380, 4 touchdowns, no turnovers, and score 40 points while doing it, that's what he's going to do. He's going to take that opportunity. I don't think that he's a guy that's going to shy away from that. And ultimately, to be honest with you, I don't think that Quinn Ewers is either, because I think that he and Sark are like one and the same to me. I think that they have a very similar personality in that, that I got a big gun and I want to use it. So I think that if given the opportunity, and they'll have the opportunity, because Washington's defensive backfield is not extremely, extremely good. Honestly, I think that Oregon would have been a more difficult test for Texas in this situation, because Oregon is a more balanced team. Oregon has a more, balanced attack, offense to defense. So I think that getting Washington is going to be a blessing in disguise, because it's going to feed towards kind of what we saw, this past week. I don't think that it'll be a blowout, but I think that Texas's offense will have a really good day. The one question I did have for you.
Okay.
They scored on a trick play early in the game to Jatavion Sanders, a guy who's from right up the road here in Denton, Texas, not far from where I am now. And he's really coming on. He really has impressed me in the last couple of weeks, because his first year or two at Texas, he didn't really do too much. Do you think that it was a mistake using those trick plays before getting into the playoff? Because to me, I know he has more. Now, it's not a question of does Sark have more trick plays. It's just
deep, bro.
On tape when you might need that exact play to be used in a bigger situation, because I don't think that they needed that to win that game.
They didn't, but here's what it is. Sometimes you put shit on tape so people could see it, because you want them to see it. So now they're going to be looking for him, and he's not going to be able to sneak out and catch that pass. But they're not going to play the double end around as hard, because they're dropping back. So now I got you in the blender, because right when you start sagging back to guard that play, that end around is going to come full speed, and whether it's Worthy or Keelan Robinson or whoever, we're going to get that edge, and them dudes can fly. Number 7, they can go blue, whoever. Just like the it wasn't an extra point. It's a touchdown to Sweat. What's his name? Tavion Sweat.
You're talking about the trick play they ran in the end zone.
It wasn't even a trick play. That dude just ran up 3 steps and turned left, and the ball was there, or turned right and the ball was there. They just disregarded him completely. Now you can run a version of that to where the defensive tackle who was in the backfield, now you run him on some type of ugly wheel route and just tell him run to the pylon and stand there with your hands up, and you're going to be wide open. Now you've got teams thinking. You've got defense coordinators up late at night trying to figure out how can I cover every blade of grass in this situation. So I don't think he blew his big one yet, but so I don't mind putting out your trick plays, especially if they work like that. Them plays was wide open.
Both of them were wide open. I just thought it was interesting because typically the typical mindset is, hey, let me keep all of my goodies, all of my best plays. Let me keep these for situations where I'm really, really going to need them. The one that comes to my mind is the 2007 BCS championship game, or I think it wasn't the championship game, it was the Fiesta Bowl between Oklahoma and Boise State. When they ran the Statue of Liberty play for the 2-point conversion to win the game. They hadn't ran that the whole season. Why? Because they knew that we're a good enough team. We're going to get in a position to play in a New Year's Six Bowl. We want to save that for a position where we're really going to need it. And it worked to perfection because Oklahoma didn't have the backside covered because they hadn't seen it. It wasn't on tape. So I think what you're saying is legitimate, though, because I could see Sark being that kind of a guy to say, okay, I'm going to put this out there just so that you see it. And you have to spend more time on this. And maybe it's not necessarily to counter it on the same play. Maybe it's to take their attention away from the basic stuff that they're going to do. The basics. Because they have to spend more time looking at the trick plays because they're out there now. So I think that's a legitimate point. I think you make a legitimate point.
Yeah, everything is a setup. When you talk about offensive gurus, when you think about the guys from the past, whether it be Sean Payton or any other offensive genius guy like that, they will set you up all season, putting stuff out on tape, little stuff. That Boise play, the initial setup for the play, the formation, they ran something specific out of that formation all year. So when they finally ran the play that way, it was wide open. You know what I'm saying? And that's why, because they set it up in a different way. So yeah, that was a really good question. And hopefully the listeners out there got a chance to enjoy it. So if you're watching the replay, folks, hey man, leave your feedback in the comments. We definitely appreciate it. But we covered everything. Like I said, we didn't want to get into the final game just because we need to see who that's going to be first. But hopefully y'all can let us know what you think. Who do you think is going to win these first two matchups? We got some time to cook on it, and we may come back and circle back to the topic, but want to get this out there immediately and give our reaction. So before we get out, Q, did you have any thoughts for the folks?
Yeah, man. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. Thank you, everybody that's already subscribed. Please make sure that you share the podcast, share the videos, give us your feedback on some things that you guys think that you'd like to hear us give our opinions on, some things that maybe we haven't covered a whole lot. I know we didn't talk a whole lot about college football outside of the first couple of weeks. Obviously, T and I are tapping in and watching a lot of stuff, but man, I mean, it's a lot to keep up with when you talk about, college football and the NFL is starting to get, closer to their playoffs. And then we're talking about, NBA is, in the middle stride of their season. And then obviously boxing is now literally a year-round sport. There used to be a period of time where, boxing ended in September and you didn't see it again until March. Well, man, some of the biggest fights that we're going to be talking about are going to be happening just in this month alone. So everybody give your feedback. We appreciate it, no doubt.
No doubt. And like he said, man, I'm just going to piggyback off what Q's talking about. It's year round for us. So, and there's, 4 major sports that we cover. Well, 3 major sports with 4 major entities: college football, NFL, NBA, well, really college basketball too. And then you've got boxing. So there's 5 major things that we cover the most. So there's a lot of ground to try to cover and try to watch all that stuff. But we give you the best that we can give for what we get to see. So we talk about a lot of things that are kind of the big headline subjects, just to make sure you guys get our perspective on what's happening in the sports world. But again, we appreciate y'all rocking with us. Year 2 is going to be better than year 1. We want to see that number double or even triple before this year ends. So tell a friend to come and watch the Mic Check podcast. So this has been T, that's Q, Mic Check 1, 2, and we out. Peace.